My emotionally unstable wife forced me to open our marriage, but when I found my own partner, she started demanding we close it and begged me to take her back. The day my wife asked for an open marriage, she already had someone else in mind. I just didn't know it yet. Looking back, the signs were obvious. The new clothes, the sudden obsession with going to the gym, her phone never leaving her hand, the constant smiling at messages she refused to explain. I wasn't suspicious. I trusted her. We had been married for 9 years. We had bought a house together, built careers, shared holidays, birthdays, funerals, and everything in between. I honestly believed we were one of those couples who would grow old together. Then one Friday night, while we were eating dinner, she calmly told me she thought monogamy was outdated. At first I laughed because I assumed she was talking about a podcast she'd listened to. She wasn't. She explained that people weren't meant to love only one person, that modern relationships required freedom, that jealousy was just insecurity. She had clearly rehearsed the speech. Every sentence sounded polished. Every argument came out in perfect order. She finished by saying she wanted us to open the marriage. I remember sitting there, staring at my plate. I genuinely thought she was joking. When I realized she wasn't, I asked the obvious question. Was there someone else? She immediately denied it. She insisted this wasn't about another person. It was about personal growth, about exploring life, about becoming more authentic. She even claimed opening the marriage would make us stronger. I told her I wasn't interested, not because I was controlling, because I got married expecting exclusivity. That wasn't a hidden condition. It was the entire promise. She became upset almost instantly. Over the next several weeks, she brought it up constantly. Every disagreement somehow returned to the same topic. She accused me of being emotionally immature, said I wanted to own her, claimed I was afraid of confident women. Then she started sleeping in the guest room. She told friends we were going through a rough patch. She cried in front of her sister. Eventually, even my own parents asked why I wouldn't compromise. Compromise. That word followed me everywhere. As if agreeing to fundamentally change our marriage was no different than choosing where to spend Christmas. The pressure became relentless. She scheduled appointments with a couples therapist. I agreed because I genuinely wanted to save our marriage. The therapist never told me I had to accept an open marriage. Instead, she repeatedly emphasized that both partners needed enthusiastic consent. That wasn't what my wife wanted to hear. After every session, she'd complain the therapist wasn't progressive enough. She eventually refused to continue counseling. Instead, she gave me an ultimatum. Either we opened the marriage, or she wanted a divorce. I loved my wife. I didn't want to lose her. Against every instinct I had, I agreed. But only under strict conditions. Complete honesty. No lying. No hiding messages. Regular health testing. No bringing anyone into our home. Either person could leave the arrangement if it became unhealthy. She agreed immediately. Too quickly. Within 48 hours, she had her first date. 48 hours. No dating profile takes that little time to become successful. No meaningful connection appears overnight. That's when I realized something I should have understood from the beginning. She hadn't started looking after we opened the marriage. She had already found someone before asking. I asked whether she already knew him. She admitted they had been talking for months. Just talking. At least, that's what she claimed. I wanted to believe her. Mostly because the alternative hurt too much. For the next several months, she seemed happier than I'd seen her in years. She stayed out late. Took weekend trips. Spent hours texting. She stopped asking about my day, and stopped eating dinner with me, and stopped acting like we were building a life together, and we became roommates sharing bills, and whenever I looked disappointed, she reminded me that this had been my choice too, and technically, she was right, and I had agreed, and emotionally, Ni had simply been too afraid to lose my marriage, and meanwhile, nothing changed on my side, Ni wasn't interested in dating, Ni barely had enough energy to work, exercise, and pretend everything was fine. And friends noticed. I looked exhausted. And coworkers asked whether I was sleeping. Ni lied every time. And then, almost 6 months later, one of my coworkers invited me to a charity fundraiser. Ni almost declined. At the last minute, I decided sitting alone at home sounded worse. And that decision quietly changed the rest of my life. Nat, the fundraiser. I met a woman named Emily. And she wasn't flashy. And she wasn't trying to impress anyone. And she spent most of the evening helping organize donations instead of networking. And we talked for nearly an hour. Not about relationships. Not about marriage. And just books. And travel. And work. Normal conversation. And for the first time in months, I laughed without forcing it. And when I got home that night, I told my wife exactly what had happened. And that was one of our rules. Knew complete honesty. She barely looked up from her phone. She smiled and told me she hoped I enjoyed myself. Then she went back to texting someone else. Assumed she didn't care. Couldn't have been more wrong. Because 3 weeks later, Emily asked whether I'd like to have dinner. And without realizing it, was about to break the one rule my wife had never expected. Was going to be genuinely happy. Emily and I met for dinner the following Friday. And before I left the house, I reminded my wife where I was going. Nodded without looking away from her laptop. Even joked that she hoped I had a better evening than she would, because one of her own dates had canceled. Indifference hurt more than I expected. 9 years of marriage had somehow become less important than a stranger on the internet. Dinner with Emily wasn't romantic. Not at first. It felt peaceful. She asked questions because she genuinely wanted answers. She listened instead of waiting for her turn to speak. When I mentioned my marriage, I didn't hide the truth. I explained that my wife had insisted on opening our relationship. Emily didn't judge me. She simply asked one question. "Is that what you wanted?" I couldn't answer. Not because I didn't know. Because I realized nobody had asked me that in nearly a year. Everyone had asked whether I loved my wife, whether I wanted to save my marriage, whether I was willing to compromise. No one had asked whether I was actually happy. That question stayed with me long after dinner ended. Over the next 2 months, Emily and I saw each other occasionally. Coffee after work, weekend hikes, museum visits. Nothing dramatic, nothing secret. Everything followed the rules my wife herself had written. Every date was disclosed. Every overnight trip was discussed beforehand. Every boundary was respected. Ironically, I followed the open marriage agreement far more carefully than my wife ever had. Then something strange started happening. My wife became interested in me again. She suddenly wanted to know where I was going, who I was meeting, what Emily looked like, how often we talked. At first, I assumed she was simply making conversation. Then she started asking to see pictures. She wanted to know Emily's age, her job, whether she'd ever been married. Questions she had never answered when I asked about her own partner. One evening, I came home from dinner to find my wife sitting alone in the living room. She looked irritated. She casually mentioned that I'd been spending a lot of time with Emily. I reminded her that we'd spent nearly 6 months following exactly the arrangement she had proposed. She changed the subject. A week later, she asked whether I could cancel a weekend trip Emily and I had planned. She said she missed spending time together. The timing felt odd. For months, she had spent almost every weekend with someone else. Now, suddenly, she wanted date nights again. I agreed to postpone the trip. I genuinely hoped we might reconnect. She canceled our dinner plans 3 hours beforehand because her other partner unexpectedly became available. I sat alone in a restaurant that night. Looking at the empty chair across from me, something inside me finally broke. Not dramatically. Quietly. For months, I'd been trying to save a marriage that only one person seemed interested in preserving. The following morning, I called Emily. Instead of pretending everything was fine, I told her the truth. I admitted I felt lost, confused, embarrassed. She listened without interrupting. Then she said something I hadn't considered. She told me that every time we spent time together, I talked about becoming a better version of myself. I exercised more, read more, smiled more, but every time I mentioned going home, my voice changed completely. She wasn't criticizing my wife. She was simply describing what she observed. That conversation stayed with me for days. Around the same time, my wife became increasingly frustrated whenever Emily's name came up. If I smiled while texting, she'd ask who it was. If I left the house, she'd casually ask whether Emily would be there. One afternoon, I accidentally saw her searching Emily's social media profiles. She closed the page the moment she noticed me. A few days later, she admitted she'd looked. She claimed she was simply curious. But curiosity quickly turned into something else. She started comparing herself to Emily. Emily's career, Emily's appearance, Emily's hobbies. She bought new clothes, changed her hairstyle, started going to the gym even more frequently. None of it made sense. She had been the one insisting love wasn't exclusive. Now she seemed deeply uncomfortable with the idea that someone else enjoyed spending time with me. Then everything changed in a single weekend. My wife left for a 3-day trip with the man she'd been dating since before our marriage opened. She came home Sunday evening much earlier than expected. She looked exhausted. She barely spoke. The next morning, I found her sitting alone in the kitchen. She finally admitted something. The relationship she'd been so excited about was over. Apparently, the man had never intended to leave his own marriage. He had enjoyed the excitement. Nothing more. The moment she started talking about a future together, he ended things. She looked devastated. I genuinely felt sorry for her. Despite everything, I never wanted to see her hurt. For the next several days, I tried supporting her as a friend. I cooked dinner, handled chores, gave her space. I assumed she'd eventually recover. Instead, she became obsessed with fixing our marriage. Almost overnight, she wanted counseling again, weekly date nights, weekend vacations, long conversations, physical affection, everything she'd rejected months earlier. Then, one evening, she finally said the words I knew were coming. She wanted to close the marriage. Immediately. She said opening it had been a mistake. She wanted us to forget it had ever happened. She wanted things to go back to the way they were. I listened carefully. Then I asked one question. If Emily had never entered my life, would you still want to close the marriage? She didn't answer. She looked away. That silence told me everything. She hadn't changed because the arrangement was hurting us. She wanted to close it because, for the first time, it was hurting her. And for the first time in nearly a year, I realized I wasn't afraid of losing my marriage anymore. I didn't answer her immediately. Not because I was trying to punish her. Because for the first time in a long time, I wanted to think about what I wanted instead of reacting to what someone else wanted. That evening, I went for a long walk. I replayed the previous year over and over. Every conversation, every compromise, every lonely dinner. Every weekend spent wondering whether my own wife wanted to be with me. Then I remembered something Emily had once said. Healthy relationships don't make you compete for your own partner. That sentence hit differently now. When I returned home, my wife was waiting in the living room. She had clearly been crying. She immediately began talking about fresh starts. She wanted us to delete our dating apps together, renew our wedding vows, even move to another city, anything that would erase the last year. But there was one problem. She kept talking about erasing the consequences. She never really talked about the choices that created them. Over the next several weeks, she became the version of herself I'd been begging to see for years. She cooked dinner, planned movie nights, sent me thoughtful messages during work, asked about my day, held my hand. Ironically, she became the wife I'd always hoped for, only after she realized someone else appreciated me. Meanwhile, Emily noticed I had become distant. I finally told her everything. I explained that my wife wanted to close the marriage, that I felt guilty, confused, responsible for everyone's happiness except my own. Emily listened quietly. When I finished, she smiled sadly. Then she said she wasn't going to compete with my wife. She cared about me too much to become part of a tug of war. She told me to make whatever decision allowed me to respect myself 5 years from now. Not the decision that made everyone else comfortable today. Then she stepped back. She stopped initiating messages. Stopped asking to meet. Not because she was angry, because she refused to pressure me. That alone taught me more about love than the previous year of my marriage. At home, things became increasingly uncomfortable. My wife started asking whether I'd spoken to Emily. If my phone buzzed, she'd glance toward it. One evening, I caught her scrolling through our phone records. She apologized immediately. She blamed anxiety. A few days later, she admitted she had driven past Emily's neighborhood after work. She insisted it was an accident. Except Emily lived 20 miles in the opposite direction. I began realizing something difficult. Opening the marriage hadn't fixed her insecurity. It had simply redirected it. She wasn't suddenly afraid of losing me because she loved me more. She was afraid because she was no longer the only person deciding whether our marriage survived. For the first time, I had options. That terrified her. About a month later, we returned to couples counseling. The same therapist greeted us warmly. She asked what had changed. My wife spoke first. She admitted she wanted to close the marriage permanently. She described it as the biggest mistake of her life. Then the therapist asked me something simple. "What do you want?" I looked down at my hands. I realized I had spent nearly an entire year answering everyone else's questions. My wife's, my parents', our friends', never my own, so I answered honestly. I said I no longer trusted the foundation of our marriage, not because she'd dated someone else, because she'd forced me into an arrangement I never wanted by threatening divorce. Then, when it stopped benefiting her, she wanted to rewrite the rules again. The therapist nodded thoughtfully. She asked my wife whether she would have wanted to close the marriage if her own outside relationship had continued successfully. The room became painfully quiet. My wife tried to answer 3 different times. Each attempt stopped halfway. Finally, she whispered the truth. No. If her relationship had worked out, she probably would have wanted everything to stay exactly as it was. The therapist didn't criticize her. She simply said something that changed the entire session. She explained that regret is not the same thing as growth. Sometimes people regret an outcome without regretting the mindset that created it. Real change requires understanding why the original decision happened in the first place. My wife broke down crying. She admitted something she had never said before. She confessed that she hadn't wanted an open marriage because she believed in non-monogamy. She wanted one because she had already developed feelings for another man and didn't want to feel guilty about acting on them. Instead of admitting that, she had convinced herself that changing the rules of our marriage would somehow make her choices ethical. Hearing her finally tell the truth should have made me feel relieved. Instead, it made me realize I'd been grieving our marriage for months without admitting it. Because the marriage I thought I had already ended long before she asked to open it. Everything after that had simply been us arguing over what to call its remains. The counseling sessions continued for another 6 weeks, not because either of us believed they would magically repair our marriage. Because we both wanted to understand how we'd ended up there. For the first time in years, my wife stopped trying to defend herself. She admitted she had spent most of her adult life chasing validation. If someone admired her, she felt valuable. If someone lost interest, she panicked. That cycle had followed her from high school into college, then into our marriage. She confessed that when a younger coworker started flirting with her, she didn't initially plan to leave me. She simply enjoyed feeling desired again. Instead of setting boundaries, she fed the attention. When her feelings grew stronger, she faced a choice. End the emotional affair, or convince herself our marriage needed different rules. She chose the second option. Listening to her explain it was strangely calming. Not because it justified anything, because for nearly a year I'd blamed myself. I'd wondered whether I hadn't been romantic enough, whether I'd worked too much, whether I'd somehow caused this. Now I understood the truth. Her decisions had started long before I'd even known there was a problem. One evening after therapy, we sat in the driveway for almost 20 minutes without getting out of the car. She quietly admitted something that surprised me. She said the worst moment wasn't when her other relationship ended. It wasn't even when she realized I had fallen in love with someone else. The worst moment had been watching me laugh one afternoon while texting Emily. She said she'd forgotten what my genuine smile looked like. Seeing someone else bring it back forced her to realize she had slowly stopped trying. That confession hurt more than any argument we'd ever had, because it meant she had noticed my unhappiness all along. She had simply believed I'd never leave. A week later, Emily asked if we could meet one final time. She explained she needed clarity. Not pressure. Just clarity. We met at the same small coffee shop where we'd had our first conversation months earlier. She looked exactly the same. Calm. Patient. Kind. I apologized for pulling her into such a complicated situation. She stopped me before I could continue. She said none of this had been my fault. Then she admitted something she'd been keeping to herself. She had fallen in love with me. But she refused to build a future that depended on another relationship collapsing. If I chose my marriage, she would walk away completely. No resentment, no waiting, no secret messages. If I chose to leave my marriage, she wanted that decision to be made because it was right. Not because she happened to be standing on the other side. I realized then why being around her had always felt so different. She never tried to influence my choices. She simply respected them. When I got home that night, my wife asked whether I'd seen Emily. For the first time, I answered every question honestly. I told her Emily loved me. I told her she was willing to walk away if I stayed married. I told her that kind of respect had made me rethink everything I believed love was supposed to feel like. My wife started crying quietly. Not dramatically. Just quietly. She admitted she'd spent months assuming Emily would eventually manipulate me into leaving. Instead, Emily had done the exact opposite. That realization seemed to break something inside her. A few days later, she handed me a folder. Inside were divorce papers, already signed. She explained she finally understood something. Forcing me to stay wouldn't make me love her again. Neither would guilt. Neither would promises. She said she had spent an entire year trying to control outcomes instead of accepting consequences. This was the first decision she'd made that asked nothing from me. She only asked that I read the papers when I was ready. I spent 3 days thinking, walking, writing, remembering. I looked through old photographs from our honeymoon, our first apartment, the day we adopted our dog. There had been real love once. I don't doubt that. But love isn't preserved inside photographs. It's preserved through choices. And somewhere along the way, our choices stopped protecting each other. On the 4th morning, I signed the papers. Not because I hated my wife. Because I finally accepted that the marriage we'd been trying to save no longer existed. We hugged before leaving the attorney's office. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't hopeful. It was simply two people acknowledging that the story they'd imagined together had reached its final page. As I walked back to my car, my phone vibrated. It was a message from Emily. She hadn't asked what I'd decided. She hadn't pressured me. She simply hoped I was okay. For the first time in over a year, I realized I was. The divorce was finalized 4 months later. There were no dramatic courtroom arguments. No screaming. No fight over money. We sold the house. Split the proceeds exactly as our attorneys recommended. Divided the furniture. Closed our joint accounts. Canceled shared subscriptions. It was remarkable how efficiently a life built over 9 years could be reduced to a stack of signed documents. People always imagine divorce ends with one catastrophic moment. It doesn't. Sometimes it ends with hundreds of tiny decisions. Whose coffee mugs? Who keeps the dog? Which photos stay in storage? Who changes the Netflix password? The ordinary details somehow hurt the most. Our friends reacted differently than I expected. Some assumed I had left my wife for Emily. Others believed my wife had cheated, and that was the entire story. Very few people understood the truth. The truth was far less dramatic. Our marriage hadn't ended because either of us fell in love with someone else. It ended because trust had quietly died months before anyone admitted it. I never tried correcting every rumor. People usually hear only the version they're prepared to believe. About 6 weeks after moving into my apartment, I received a package. Inside was a small wooden box. No return address. I immediately recognized my ex-wife's handwriting. Inside were dozens of photographs from our marriage, pictures I'd forgotten existed. Our honeymoon. Christmas mornings, camping trips. Our first apartment with mismatched furniture. At the bottom was a short handwritten note. She wrote that she'd kept looking through those pictures trying to figure out exactly where everything went wrong. Eventually she realized there wasn't one single moment. There had been hundreds of moments when she chose temporary validation over permanent trust. She admitted that she had spent years expecting me to remain emotionally available while she slowly withdrew from the marriage herself. She ended the note by thanking me for never humiliating her publicly, even after everything that happened. I folded the letter, placed it back inside the box, then put it away. Some memories deserve respect even if the relationship doesn't survive. Several months passed before I spoke to Emily again. Not because either of us lost interest, because we'd promised not to begin anything until my divorce was completely finished and enough time had passed for both of us to know the difference between loneliness and genuine love. When we finally met again, nothing felt rushed. There were no grand declarations. No dramatic reunion. We simply picked up a conversation we'd started nearly a year earlier. This time, neither of us had to check our phones. Neither of us had to explain where we were going afterward. There were no complicated rules. No emotional negotiations. Just honesty. Dating Emily felt strangely unfamiliar. If something bothered her, she said it. If I needed space, she respected it. If either of us made a mistake, we talked about it before resentment had time to grow. At first, I kept waiting for the other shoe to drop. I'd become so accustomed to emotional instability that peace almost felt suspicious. Emily noticed. One evening she gently asked why I apologized so often. I hadn't realized I was doing it. Apparently I apologized for working late, for choosing a restaurant, for forgetting tiny things, for having different opinions. She smiled and told me I didn't have to earn the right to exist in every conversation. That sentence stayed with me for weeks. Around the same time, I heard through mutual friends that my ex-wife had continued therapy. Unlike before, she wasn't jumping into another relationship. She had changed jobs. Volunteered at a local mental health organization. Started rebuilding friendships she'd neglected for years. For the first time since I'd known her, she seemed focused on becoming healthy rather than simply appearing happy. Oddly enough, that made me genuinely happy for her. Not because I wanted her back, because healing is something I wouldn't wish against anyone. Nearly a year after our divorce, she sent one final email. She didn't ask to meet, she didn't ask for another chance. She only wanted to apologize without expecting forgiveness. She admitted that, for a long time, she'd mistaken being desired for being loved. Whenever attention faded, she'd looked for another source instead of addressing the emptiness inside herself. She said losing our marriage forced her to confront parts of herself she'd avoided for years. She ended the message with one sentence that caught me off guard. She thanked Emily, not sarcastically, sincerely. She wrote that if another woman hadn't shown me what a healthy relationship looked like, I might have stayed in an unhealthy marriage forever. I never replied. Some apologies don't require an answer. They simply deserve to be heard. 2 years later, Emily and I became engaged. The proposal wasn't extravagant, no photographers, no flash mob, just a quiet evening overlooking the lake where we'd taken our first walk together. She said yes before I even finished asking. When we started planning the wedding, she asked whether I wanted a large ceremony. I surprised both of us by saying no. I'd already learned that love isn't measured by how many people witness your promises. It's measured by how consistently you keep them afterward. Looking back, people often ask me whether agreeing to an open marriage was the biggest mistake of my life. It wasn't. The biggest mistake was believing that sacrificing my own values was the price of keeping someone who was already halfway out the door. Opening the marriage didn't destroy it. It simply exposed what had already been broken. Ironically, the arrangement my wife fought so hard to create ended up teaching me the lesson she never intended me to learn. I deserved to be chosen willingly, not conditionally, not conveniently. Not only after someone else recognized my worth. And in the end, she begged me to close the marriage because she was afraid of losing me. Then, she'd misunderstood the situation completely. And she hadn't lost me when I met Emily. And she lost me the day she asked me to betray my own principles just to keep her from leaving. And everything after that was simply the echo of a decision she'd already made. In 3 years after the divorce, I stopped introducing myself as someone who had been through a failed marriage. Ni was simply me. That surprised me more than anything. And for a long time, I believed what happened would define the rest of my life. Instead, it became one chapter. An important one. But still just a chapter. Emily and I married in a small ceremony beside the lake where we'd spent countless weekends walking together. And fewer than 30 people attended. No elaborate decorations. No expensive venue. No dramatic vows. Just close friends, immediate family, and 2 people who had learned exactly how fragile trust could be. During the ceremony, I didn't promise perfection. Neither did Emily. And we promised honesty. And we promised that if something ever felt broken, we'd talk about it before resentment had time to grow. Knit sounded simple. Nan after everything I'd lived through, I knew it wasn't. About 6 months after the wedding, I received one last unexpected message from my ex-wife. She wasn't asking for another chance. She wasn't asking to meet. She only wanted to tell me she'd recently completed 2 years of therapy. She had become a volunteer helping people recover from emotionally unhealthy relationships. Ironically, she now spent her weekends teaching others about boundaries, accountability, and honest communication. She admitted she sometimes felt guilty standing in front of those groups because she had once been the person causing the harm. But she also believed that pretending her past never happened would only waste the lessons she'd paid so dearly to learn. At the end of her message, she wrote something I never expected. She thanked me for refusing to pretend everything was okay. She said that if I had agreed to simply close the marriage and continue as though nothing had happened, she probably never would have confronted the deeper issues inside herself. Losing the marriage had been devastating. But losing it honestly had forced her to finally become honest with herself. I read the message twice. Then I quietly wished her well. I didn't reply. Not because I was angry. Because there was nothing left that needed to be said. And some endings don't require another conversation. Years continued to pass. Emily and I welcomed a daughter into our lives. Holding her for the first time changed something inside me. One night, while rocking her to sleep, I caught myself wondering what kind of husband I wanted her to one day expect from someone else. Then I realized the answer was even more important. Wanted to show her what a healthy marriage actually looked like. Not through speeches. Through ordinary days. NBI apologizing when I was wrong. NBI listening before defending myself. NBI treating disagreements as problems to solve together instead of battles to win. And children learn far more from what they watch than what they're told. None afternoon, years later, I ran into my ex-wife completely by accident at a bookstore. For a second, neither of us spoke. Then we smiled politely. And she looked peaceful. Not happier than everyone else. Not trying to impress anyone. And just comfortable in her own skin. And we spent a few minutes catching up. And she told me she was engaged to someone she'd met nearly 2 years after our divorce. And she said one of the first conversations they ever had was about accountability. Not blame. Accountability. And she told him the entire story before their third date. Enough. He couldn't accept her past. She wanted him to leave before either of them became emotionally invested. Instead, he appreciated her honesty. As we said goodbye, she looked at me and quietly admitted something. She said that years ago, she thought love meant never losing the person you wanted. Now she understood that real love begins with becoming someone who deserves to be trusted. Then she walked away. I watched her disappear into the crowd. There was no sadness, no longing, no regret, just gratitude that both of us had finally become people we probably should have been years earlier. Friends still occasionally ask whether I regret agreeing to open the marriage. I always tell them the same thing. If I could go back in time, I would still refuse it. Not because open relationships can never work. They absolutely can when both people genuinely want the same kind of relationship, communicate honestly, and freely consent. Our marriage failed because none of those things existed. The relationship wasn't opened out of mutual trust. It was open to justify a choice that had already been made. That difference changed everything. The greatest lesson I learned wasn't about marriage. It was about self-respect. The moment you abandon your own values just to stop someone from leaving, you've already started losing yourself. And once you lose yourself, no relationship, monogamous or open, can truly save you. In the end, my ex-wife believed opening our marriage would give her more freedom. Instead, it forced both of us to face uncomfortable truths. She discovered that validation isn't the same as love. I discovered that peace is worth more than keeping a relationship alive at any cost. People sometimes assume this story ends with one winner and one loser. It doesn't. It ends with two people taking different roads after making painful mistakes. One rebuilt her life through accountability. The other rebuilt his through self-respect. Looking back now, I don't remember the arguments nearly as much as I remember the lesson. The healthiest relationship you'll ever have is the one where neither person has to convince the other to stay. They choose each other. Nan again. Every single day.